We'll be going on air soon.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to today's episode of Talking Point. Our guest today is a well-known journalist, a senior media consultant, and who has spent his life, a good deal of time of his life, in Africa and Southeast Asia, reporting from there for BBC. Presently, he has also done some films for international organizations, and we'll be watching a few clips, some footage from those films about Bangladesh. Welcome to the show, Martin.
My pleasure, Neaz.
How are you today?
I'm very well indeed, yes. It's nice to be with you and to see how a company like yours is generating the transfer of information and knowledge and about events in this country to a much wider international audience, especially the Bengali audience.
Yes, it's the Bangladeshi diaspora, one thing, living in Europe, and that's our first target. And obviously, we can be watched through NTV Player.
Yes.
On the internet throughout the world.
Well, this is the information age, isn't it? So the more we can generate interest in topics and knowledge about things that are happening in the world in conversations like this, then I think television and journalism is doing its job properly.
Right. First thing first, you are aware, our viewers, that Sir David Frost died a couple of days ago, and as a person who admired him most, I would miss him. And I'm sure our guest today, who was Mr. Frost, Sir Frost was with BBC also for some time. Then he was with the ITV and then London Weekend.
Yes.
And
yes.
So very famous saying, hello, welcome, and good evening.
Yes.
I can't do that, but I really remember and miss him,
Yeah.
and the whole world will miss him.
Yeah.
Martin, you started your international journalism career somewhere in Kenya. How was journalism like in those days?
Well, that was quite a long time ago, and journalism has changed, unrecognizable from the days when I started my career. I did a little bit of journalism in this country, but then really I got busy when I moved to Africa, to Kenya, and worked on the daily newspaper there. But about the time that I was starting my career, it was a time when you mentioned the dear departed David Frost there. It was that time in the 1960s when he was becoming very established, and he, in a way, opened a new pathway for young journalists like myself at that time. He personified or epitomized, if you like, that revolution in thinking that there was in Europe, and I think especially in the UK at that time, where people suddenly had a liberation to be much more free thinking, to experiment with things in the media, in culture, in music, in the whole way that they approached their political leaders. And
sarcasm, particularly with a program like What a Week That Was.
That was the week that was, yeah. Yes. Which helped to put satire on the media map. Of course, it had always been there in other forms. I mean, this country has always had a good history of political satire, but in the run-up to the 1960s, I think that had been slightly forgotten, and we were still in what we call the age of deference, where you had authority and you had people who had to respect authority. There was like two opposite ends there.
He was the angry young man of journalism at that time.
Well, he was a very effective young man. He used his anger in very controlled, effective ways. He wasn't what you see often on television these days, and I think especially in America, where being angry is the first thing to do. Your instant way is aggression towards an interview subject, but that was not his style at all. He had a much more gentle, but at the same time more sophisticated approach to interviewing somebody.
Yep.
And by doing that was able to elicit much more interesting information and get to the core of that person that he was interviewing.
Yeah, as I read somewhere, I think he said, or somebody else said about him, that you don't need to be a Rottweiler to get the answers. See?
Well, that's a very good way of putting it. He wasn't a Rottweiler, but he wasn't a poodle either.
No.
He was an extremely intelligent, sensitive person who listened to what the person he was interviewing was saying, and hence was able to build on what they were saying and get to the character of that person,
right.
and get them to perhaps say things which at first, at the start of the interview, they might not have wanted to impart. But by gaining the confidence of the person
Yes,
he's speaking
yes.
to, then they come out. And just briefly, the very best example of that you will see is when Frost interviewed former President Nixon, and at the end of it, got this great man. He'd been President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world. He got him to reflect inwards on himself, what he'd done, the terrible things that he'd done wrong, which he'd never said publicly before to American journalists or anybody else. But by the skill of interviewing him, David Frost was able to make this former President of the United States say, I did it wrong, I let all these people down.
Yeah.
And that was quite a monumental moment in journalistic history and political history also.
And
so
also in Sir David Frost's life.
in David Frost's life, indeed, well, I guess he already had made his name, but that really enhanced it and made sure that David Frost's legacy to journalism, to broadcasting, and to politics will live for a long, long time after his death.
Yep.
Now, I'm sorry I digressed a little bit there from your question, I know, but I use that as an example to say how journalism has changed, and people like him around at the time when I was beginning my career made me think in different ways about how journalism can contribute so much to the cultural picture of what is going on in one's country and internationally, because he pushed the barriers. Journalism can be a safe area if you let it, and I think in many areas, especially you see in developing countries, where for very good reasons, of course, media outlets have to be very careful about what they say. In European countries, at the time we're talking about in the 60s, of course, there were no political restrictions on what you could say, but there was, I think, cultural restrictions, which were a reflection of the intellectual, political life of the day, where, as I say, you had people like the royals were much more highly respected, their lives were not questioned, and the same with politicians. So journalists were, in a way, neglecting their full responsibility to tackle and to ask the awkward questions. They did a little bit, but they were part of that age of deference. People like David Frost came along, and suddenly that lid is taken off, and there is a much more free flow of information. There is much more confidence on the part of the media to say, we won't be put in a little box and told just to report what we want you to report. We will ask those difficult questions. We will embarrass politicians. We will embarrass the royal family if necessary.
We have a role to play.
Indeed.
Yes, and you mentioned royal families, you see. This greater interest, or the royal birth, seems to have generated interest among the public. Would you agree?
Yes, it has.
The royalty?
There was the royal marriage, and then soon after the royal birth, and in between there was the Queen's Jubilee of 60 years on the throne. And I think those three things, but especially the marriage and the birth, have they were a breath of fresh air for the royal family and for the way that the public perceives the royal family. The royal family went through an extremely risky period from about the middle of the 1990s onward, at the time of Diana's death, she was a popular figure with the public. The royal family at large was perceived to have not treated her well and not even responded very well to her death. And this in turn contributed to a reduction in the love and support for the royal family. And I think at that point, that was perhaps the lowest that it got. And suddenly they got together and with some wise advisors said, look, you have got to do something about this. You have got to make your image more attractive, especially to younger people. You've got to appear more in tune with the people who you are reigning over. And that message sank in. And I think the two people who got married, Prince William and Kate, were the ideal candidates to lift the image of the royal family in this country and abroad, internationally. They look different, they behave different, they have a completely different rapport. Whereas before there might have been respect, shall we say, for someone like Prince Charles, but there's never been much of a warmth, I feel. But with these two young people, you know, they look like the people who were sat next to me on the tube on my way here. They look like my neighbours. When the baby was born a few weeks ago, Prince William came out. He was carrying the baby.
He like was a normal person.
Like a normal person.
Open neck.
That's kind of implying the royal people are not normal, and that, some people would definitely argue that. But you know, he had an open neck shirt. He was wearing what looked like denim jeans. Royals wearing denim jeans. He opened the car door himself.
He drove himself.
Well, a royal person knows how to drive a motor car. That's quite an astounding idea. But to him, of course, perfectly normal. And I think that really struck a chord with a lot of people who had become ambivalent about the royal family. They didn't like their distance. They didn't like their arrogance. But suddenly they see a royal person who's completely different. He dresses differently. He talks differently. He does a proper job, for one thing. He's a pilot with the Royal Air Force. He has a job. People look at his father, Prince Charles, who will be
most of the young people in this country, they have seen Prince Charles as an old man.
Well, yes, I'm afraid he is. You know, some people, he's what, in his early 60s. Some people in their early 60s look an old man. Some people in their early 60s look not so old, middle-aged, shall I say, as a person who falls into that bracket myself.
But you see, it's a relative
it's
question.
Relative, yes. But with Prince Charles, let me say, if he was chosen as the next astronaut to go into space, you know how he would be dressed when he goes into space? He'd have a sharp double-breasted suit, he'd have a sharp tie, and because that's all he ever wears. That's the only thing that people see him wearing. If he went into the jungle or the desert or an important occasion where you're meant to wear a suit, or if he went into space, he would wear the same thing all the time. And people see these royals doing the same thing generation after generation, and I'm afraid to many people Prince Charles embodies that way that the royal family won't change. They won't react to the changing pace of modern life, and therefore they look like an anachronism.
But not William and Kate. They see them
not William and Kate, no. They do seem completely different. I mean, you might expect a gradual change in the generations, but with those two, I think they made a drastic change in the generations. And I think, to some extent, the royal family has been born afresh, and we will wait to see how they grow into their new roles.
It's also good for the economy of the country, see, because the royal family is not just the royal family, it's also a tourist attraction.
Well, that's an argument that's often put forward by the supporters of the monarchy and the people who are against the monarchy. And there is a sizable nucleus of people who think we should not have a monarchy, we should be a republic. Those people would say that people come to this country for the history. You will still have the wonderful history of this country. Wonderful recorded history going back over 1,000 years. That will still be there.
Every building, every corner has a history, see. And all the areas around Buckingham Palace, the
Yes.
Royal Gardens, the swans.
Absolutely. That would all be there. Even Buckingham Palace would be there.
Okay.
Except there wouldn't be a king or a queen living in
Now,
it.
we have to take a break. Viewers, we'll have to take a break, and then when we come back, we'll continue our discussion with our guest today, Martin Lumb, an international media consultant. Don't go away. We'll be back soon.
আপনারা দেখছেন টকিং পয়েন্ট, সৌজন্যে মাহবুব এন্ড কো অ্যাকাউন্টেন্টস।